So I'm going to be moderating this session with fear, because the people who I am moderating know so much more than I do. And I call on you to ask questions throughout to help me out. Without more ado, right, I'd like to introduce my panelists. Ah, here they are. I'm hoping that they're going to turn up as they do on the internet. Elena, I'm afraid, can't be with us today. Now, I reckon this session is really about how do we know? Yeah, how do we know what we're going to invest in is any good? And perhaps we could kick off with a poll. Can we kick off with a poll? No, we can't kick off with a poll either. I'm not doing very well, am I? Okay, how can we tell? Now, I'll ask you, how can we tell, Giles, whether or not the companies that we want to invest in are doing what they're saying on the packet? What is the way in which we can check for the authenticity of the statements these organizations are making?
With difficulty.
Expand.
My name is Giles Gibbons. I run a company called Good Business. We're a sustainability consultancy. We have been working with global corporates and nearly half of the FTSE 100 over the last 26 years. And part of the area that we're involved in is not only helping them think about how they manage sustainability within their organizations, but then how they communicate what they're doing and how they're doing it to their stakeholders. And increasingly interested audience being investors in the last 3 or 4 years. And so to your point, I think what's been really interesting in thinking about the whole reporting journey, I think it's really important to start with a sort of the recognition that financial reporting has been around for about 170 years and changes and evolves, and over that period a huge amount in order to finesse it, to provide trustworthy information that enables investors and others to make informed decisions. Non-financial reporting has been around for about 20 years and has a huge amount of variabilities that financial reporting doesn't have, and has been on a massive learning curve, I think, as it tries to provide the right information to the right people at the right time to enable them to make the decisions that they want to do. And it certainly hasn't got it right all the way through. But I think it is beginning to at least enable particularly investors to understand where it's starting, what it's trying to do, what it's committed to, and how it reports within a whole bunch of different frameworks. And that is getting better. It's not brilliant. ESG in all its different forms requires businesses to report and answer questions in so many different forms that it's almost impossible for companies to be able to respond to all of those. The answer to that is people go, well, can we make those requests and frameworks more generic? The more you make them more generic, they're less good at telling you actually the right information that you want to know about the organization. So there are sort of huge sort of challenges that are faced within it. And Stuart Kirk from HSBC has been alighting some of those this summer, and I think has been we're in a really interesting process, and we're certainly not at the end of it, but I think that things are going in the right direction.
I'm going to, thanks very much for that, and that's a great way of starting. I'm going to see if we've actually got our remote panelists. Have we yet got them? Ah, here we have. And I'm guessing it's Charlotte. Hello, Charlotte. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, I can hear you. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you all.
Very nice to meet you too. Now, you just may have heard Giles talking about financial reporting. And I know this is a great area of interest to you at the IMF. How do we actually look at these measures? There seem to be so many of them. How do we look at these measures, and how do we use these measures to actually get a good idea of what's really going on? What's good, what's bad? How do we tell?
Oh, sure. Thank you. So indeed, I mean, I work myself in the monitoring capital markets of the IMF, and we work on a series of financial sector policies for climate. And also we do, of course, surveillance, multilateral and bilateral surveillance when it comes to climate related risks, and capacity building, technical assistance, essentially, of course, to emerging markets and developing economies in this area. And we do participate quite a bit in terms of bilateral policymaking, but also at the global level to everything related to what we call a climate information architecture. So the role of data, of disclosures, taxonomy to ensure that there is capital allocation towards a real, low carbon technologies and processes, industrial processes, and in view of a realignment of capital flows on a low carbon trajectory, but also it's all related at the end of the day to the credibility and the reliability of what you do and what you do report and what you do disclose. And that's all very much important since we've seen this rise in net zero commitments all over the world. I mean, at national level, regional level sometimes, but also within companies themselves, non-financial and financial companies. And I think that something really important to us, it's the science-based nature of all that. I mean, that seems quite obvious maybe, but we see that, of course, there is a lot of discrepancy when it comes to the underlying criteria of net zero commitments and net zero plans and transition plans themselves. And so I'd be happy to talk about that, in the remainder of the hour. But what's important to note is that the net zero, it's a complex scientific element and objective that takes into consideration, of course, the substantial reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and how that can be done primarily, and maybe I shouldn't say primarily, but let's say first and foremost by the end of fossil fuels. And I think the IPCC and the International Energy Agency reports shows very well that it's not just about unabated coal-fired power, as we've seen in the recent COP agreement. It's actually for all kinds of fossil fuels. So it's this on the one hand, but it's also a series of criteria related to socioeconomic considerations, but also to the place that should be given to carbon offsets and carbon removals that is very well framed actually in the scientific literature, and also the protection of the storing capacity of natural carbon sinks, so oceans and soils and forests, and all of this makes up that concept of net zero. So at the IMF, we're very much attached to that, and that that sort of materializes in a series of ways, of course, in our relations with member countries, but also for instance, when participating to the consultative committee of the ISSB, so this new global standard setter for climate disclosures, the International Sustainability Standards Board, we are very much pushing for that science-based definition of net zero. And also when it comes to the work we do within global financial supervisors, for instance, as part of the network on greening financial system or the Financial Stability Board, every time it comes down to that question of net zero plans and how do you assess the reliability of and the credibility of climate disclosures, this definition of net zero is very, very important. And we see a lot of greenwashing when it comes to the role of carbon offsets, for instance, when the IPCC is very clear on the credibility of all of these mechanisms. So we have published, for instance, I would be happy to sort of circulate it to the members here, to the panelists, and to the audience who is interested. But we replied publicly to the consultation of the ISSB on its most recent climate standard, and something really important to us was also to be sure that indeed there are disclosures, for instance, on carbon offsets, because for many companies they actually constitute a key pillar of their net zero strategy, but actually there should be transparency because lots of them are not fit for purpose and are not science-based. And so it's important also that all stakeholders and shareholders in particular, but not only have access to the information and to the credibility or not of these carbon offset mechanisms, for instance. So these are, issues where we are working on, and also we're working on, for instance, on the on the taxonomies topic, and not only taxonomies, actually all kinds of climate assessment methodologies, like how can we ensure that we have a global baseline for all of these mechanisms, and this is all the more important that some of these taxonomies, for instance, or asset level or company level assessment methodologies for climate, they are very much fragmented globally, and some of them are not necessarily sticking to the science when it comes to the methodologies or the processes or the thresholds for climate alignment. So this is also something we are very much working on. So just to finish on that, because I could totally specify when it comes down to the role of net zero and its multiple dimensions, but at the IMF, really, it's like we do a lot of our work when it comes to financial sector policies, at least to on the climate, what we call the climate information architecture. So to answer your question much more directly and rapidly, I think that this is how we see also the reliability of all this. I could totally touch upon later, for instance, with the governance pillar. That is really important as well, but I think I've been too long already, so I'll leave you the floor, and happy to to answer additional questions if you do have some.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Charlotte. I'm hoping that the IMF is going to help me with my question, and it sounds as if you've got a lot of ideas and a lot of work going on there. I'm going to see if we can find our final panelist, and whether he's out there in the ether somewhere, Mr. Professor Paul Watchman. Are you there, Paul? We're getting close, but not. Well, I'm going to come back to you, Giles, because after that excellent introduction.
Can I just kind of pick up on a couple of points there? Because I think that was a sort of excellent example of actually the journey that we've traveled in many ways. If you think 10 years ago, companies were talking about carbon neutrality. The only people talking about carbon neutrality now are the Qatar World Cup. It's a sort of busted flush in a way, and net zero is a far more credible. There's far more data, far more requirements, far more scientific protocols around it, which need to be followed in order that companies can say what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I think it's really important to understand that trajectory, and that we've got to keep going in that, keep pushing, and for these things to get better and better. I suppose my point is also that we have to therefore sort of provide data in the moment that we're in, with the knowledge that we have, and not get too worried, too concerned that it might not be perfect data, but be really open about what that data is, how we got to it, and what we're going to do with it. Otherwise, we're going to be sitting here as Rome burns, right? We need this data, particularly around carbon, in order to create reduction plans, in order to get to a net zero future, not for the data itself. And I think at the moment, too many companies are incredibly worried about the sort of the legality and the concern about them putting out and publishing data and then committing to reduction when they feel like they don't have full knowledge, in a sense. But we need those companies to give it a go. We need organizations. I have a particular client that's in the FTSE 100 that won't publish a scope 3 measurement because they're concerned that they don't know the full picture of their scope 3 position, and therefore they won't present it, publish it, and they won't provide a reduction plan for it, and therefore no change is happening. Now, I feel like we need to know where we're at any point in time, 2022, 2023, and say, with the data that we have, with the knowledge that we have, with the understanding of the importance of the issues that our business impacts on, this is where we're at, this is what we're going to do about it, and this is how we're going to prove to you that we're doing those things or not doing them. And I think that is really important. So the transparency of how you've got to your measurement, the transparency about what you're doing about it, and enabling people to interrogate that, I think should allow them to go, actually, we got that wrong. We measured it or we over measured it, and that should be part of the process, because we're still very much at the early days of providing this information in the right format, in the right way, in order for people to make more informed decisions about it.
Yeah, I think this is such a great point. I read a lot of these TCFD reports, which quite frankly, some of them seem to be making sense to me, some of them don't. But the very fact that we have those reports means that we're getting better, and that the next year's report's going to be better and better and better. It strikes people, if we didn't have TCFD reporting, we wouldn't have any movement towards the ambitious targets that most of the pension funds that I deal with have given.
And that, as part of the sustainability movement, the concept of reporting, the concept of it is that if you ask an organization to report on something in 1 year, and then report on it in the next year, you've got a continuum, and therefore you can make decisions on what they're doing and how they're doing it, and whether. And actually, as business, as we know, is mostly full of sort of business managers who want sort of good project managers. No business sits there going, "Oh, well, we won't deal with that." Then there is a pressure for things to get better, and reporting enables that innate process, I think, in human beings to want to make things better. And there is pressure on it from different stakeholders to say it should get better, right? So the reporting process is such a fundamental process of creating change, and that's I think what we need it to do. And in doing that, and in each stakeholder playing its part, yes, we think that this business is going as fast as we want it to, or it could go faster. Investors, NGOs, and other stakeholders can then play a more and more important part in helping put pressure on or support those businesses that are better businesses.
So I'm very interested in why people wouldn't want to report. And I guess from what you're saying, there may be two things. First of all, they don't want to be held to account if what they say is going to happen doesn't happen. And secondly, they may actually find the physical business of reporting a pain in the neck, which I certainly know a lot of trustees who I speak to sort of secretly swear under their breath whenever I mention TCFD, as they do for a lot of sort of compliance reporting. What do you think are the major barriers that face corporates, your clients, in actually presenting to the public their plans? Is it this fear, or is it the operational issues of getting the data, or what is it that's holding people back?
Yeah, and what's interesting for me about non-financial reporting is the wrong people hold the control in the reporting process. So you've got the sort of different constituent parts within business that are not connected in the way that financial reporting works. So financial reporting works because the finance department, there's a very clear trajectory. You've got budgeting. It works. In non-financial reporting, those impacts, social and environmental, could be at every single different part of that business, and no one's in control of all of them. They haven't got there's not an easy pyramid structure within there. And so within that, there's so much education is going on about why we need the data, who can help get that data, and then what they need to do about that data when they've got it. I think many businesses are relearning, and you can see organizations in that brilliant amoebic way that I think business is just such an amazing force, because it is able to change itself and adapt to the requirements of society in a way that charities certainly aren't, governments certainly aren't. And that's why we're increasingly looking for business to be the greatest driver of social and environmental change, because it's actually able to respond to what society is and wants and does and deliver it, right? That's why it works so well. But it's been a massive change. And I think we're, still within that, even if you take one issue like carbon, trying to understand and get to the bottom of the carbon measurement of an organization is incredibly difficult when you've got these complex businesses that have got operations in loads of different countries. They've got value, you know, supply chains all over the world, you know, just trying to get to the bottom of, and that's just one really important issue. What about all the other issues, social and environmental? And then trying to bring that all together, make sense of it, you know, have our targets, manage it, prioritize it, and then report it to a bunch of investors who've all got 1,000 different priorities themselves. So I think in a way, I'd like to give us all a bit of a break, that we are not getting it all perfectly right all the time. But actually, this is a real project to work together and collaboratively and very openly. And I think by doing that, we can get there further and faster, create greater change, and have more, better, good stakeholders. Because we don't want just good businesses. We need good stakeholders as well. We need good investors. And we need, you know, everyone needs to be pointing in the right direction, not just one element trying to fight the others.
Charlotte, can I bring you back in? Unless we do have Paul, do we? Yes, Charlotte. You've heard what Giles has had to say. Yeah. Do you think that this is the right approach? This let's learn on the job type approach, or would you prefer to have something which is imposed by, say, the IMF or by an external organization, and make sure that you have the framework in place before you start reporting? Which way round should it be?
Well, I mean, like, the IMF is like does not impose anything. I mean, like, it's not a regulatory institution, right? So I mean, when it does, it's the conditionalities, but that's slightly different. I would say that, I mean, the IMF is still in favor of and actually promoting that through various ways of mandatory disclosure requirements when it comes to climate, especially because for many reasons that are actually stemming from a cost benefit analysis and economic considerations, mandatory disclosures you know, lead to better outcomes. And the reason why I'm saying that also is because most of the policy for now has been, let's say, targeted at what we call informational policy. I mean, we do anticipate that better information will lead to better investment decision, right? But it's all based on an efficient markets hypothesis that, you know, the reality of things has shown that is not fully there, right? So it's only a prerequisite. And this is what the IMF says, is that everything we're talking about when it comes to the data, to the disclosures, it's a prerequisite. It's at the foundation. It's not the end of the story. I mean, you're not, you know, reporting doesn't lead you to effective decarbonization, right? It's a means to show your investors, for instance, what you're doing and what you need to do better. It's also a means of dialogue between the company and its financiers. It's a means of accountability as well to your stakeholders, but it's not the end of the journey, right? So the reason why I'm saying that is that at the end of the day, what counts apart from the mandatory manner and who, I mean, the mandatory topic and who elaborates it, it's also about the credibility of the underlying criteria. I agree that, you know, data, I mean, we're not aiming at perfect data anyway. We don't have time for that. I mean, the carbon budget is being eaten more and more as we speak. And at the end of the day, just science gets back to us saying that, you know, it's either like we do it or, you know, we'll have to adapt to a very, you know, very bad world we live in. So what imports is the credibility of not only just the data you report, but also the planning that you do. And I think when it comes down to the topic of net zero, I was touching upon earlier, this is where you cannot drift away from the science. And that's why you have these attributes to a credible net zero that have to sort of feed in every single strategy, and all the rest is just not what you should have, right? So attributes of a credible net zero, I mean, it comes down to, you know, the front-loaded emission reductions that you have to achieve. It comes down to the fact that you need to have that comprehensive approach to emission reductions. It's not just, you know, and the traditional focus of emissions reduction strategies has been energy, and the scale up of renewable energy remains, of course, at the core of decarbonization, but actually in lots of sectors, you know, you have also other ways, especially in the hard to abate sectors, to reach net zero. And that doesn't just come down to the renewable energy topic. It's also a wide array of industrial techniques and emission reduction techniques that you have to apply. The credibility, sorry, of net zero, it's also being very cautious about the use, as I was saying, of carbon dioxide removal. I mean, in principle, net zero can be achieved through different levels of residual emissions and different forms of compensating removals. But in reality, there is a strong case for a net zero balance that combines a very low level of residual emissions with low levels of removals that would span over decades. And that's really important from a scientific point of view, because carbon dioxide removal, for instance, will probably be constrained by cost considerations and geopolitical factors, and also biological or technological and institutional limitations as well. And these play on our ability to actually remove the carbon from the atmosphere and store it durably and safely. And you have all of these moral hazards, risks that stem as well. So very cautious use of carbon dioxide removal, and effective regulation of carbon offsets. And I think that's where the regulatory topic comes back in, because you have a series, for instance, again, in our reply to the consultation of the ISSB, we make a very strong point on that, on the role of carbon offsets that should not appear as a solution to achieve net zero. We emphasize the fact that, for instance, there we recognize the value of disclosing explicitly on the use of carbon offsets, but because you need greater clarity on transition plans and you need to avoid greenwashing, but also the need, it would be detrimental, for instance, here, that disclosures legitimize practices that contribute very little or even unfavorable to the achievement of the emission reduction targets with the Paris Agreement. So the role, the whole topic related to the effective regulation of carbon offsets is very important. And then you have, of course, all the social economic considerations also to net zero that have to be incorporated. And so let's say that the data doesn't have to be perfect, but the actual transition plans and disclosures that you make, especially when they're attached to net zero commitments that everyone has to take, that has to be that has to be fully aligned with science, and also making sure that there's no greenwashing associated with that, because now you see pretty much everyone having these net zero commitments, but the attachment to the connection, let's say, to the science is not clear every time. And I think there I would totally advise to go back to that excellent report by the high-level expert group under the UN Secretary General that has published a report on the net zero for non-state entities, and that has been published right ahead of COP27, and that provides, let's say, all the necessary, not just data or disclosure elements, but just characteristics of what these net zero commitments are. And of course, that's very complex. I totally agree with the fact that, alongside your value chains, all of this reporting is super complex, but that's why we really insist on the fact that it does not just come down to the reporting itself and to having the most perfect report, and comes down to how do you actionate like these different decarbonization levers all along your value chain, collect the data as much as you can from your subsidiaries in Southeast Asia as much as you would in Europe or in the UK or elsewhere, and just make sure you action at the most efficient decarbonization levers, but in the context of a net zero strategy that sticks to science. And that's what I think is really important in terms of credibility to your stakeholders, but also credibility just to society, let's say, because otherwise we won't get there. I hope that answers your question more or less. I was trying to incorporate back in the net zero topic that we had discussed previously.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm going to throw this out to the audience now, because there's a lot there which I didn't understand, I have to say, but I hope you did. Yeah, and I'm sure some of you got some questions, both for Giles and Charlotte. Yes, at the front.
Giles, at one point you talked about marrying reporting and financials. Can I possibly put an idea in your head as to how we might do that? You talked about TCFD, and I was extremely rude about TCFD this morning. I actually believe it's a very important basis on which we need to build. The question is, where do we go to? If you go back to the 70s, when inflation was the great enemy, you may remember that the accountancy profession developed a thing called inflation cost accounting, and all public companies had to report their numbers in two formats. Why should we not have, and I won't use the G, ES accounting, so that they're reporting the numbers, the actual numbers, and then reporting actually what those numbers look like in relation to what they've done to the planet?
Yeah. So, there is a movement in that direction. Integrated reporting is sort of becoming more of the norm, as in not keeping the two things separate. And I think that as the accountants actually, and you know, most of the non-financial reporting is being done by the accountants, but they're two different teams, right? And so as those teams, you know, as a graduate comes up and does a bit of both, they sort of, you know, I think integrated reporting and them understanding it and therefore recognizing it's slightly different and that you need to deal with it slightly different. But yes, bringing those two things together and therefore making sense of an organization from its financial and non-financial perspective is where we will get to, right? There's absolutely no two ways about it. My only challenge is that when you say ES, the ES of Anglo-American is incredibly different to the ES of Microsoft. And I think that the difference with financials is that they all end up with sort of pounds, shillings, and pence, right? They can be incredibly different, but it all sort of comes together under sort of, you know, in the simplicity of money, right? Whereas the complexity that sits in E and S, and listen to this conversation about, this is just one issue, right, which is carbon. It's bloody complicated, and that you need a whole bunch of people who are actually specialists in lots of those different bits in order to get good data and good reporting and that sort of works together. And so I think one of the challenges about integrated reporting is whether they can literally be one team in the companies and at the consultancy level, because they do require a whole bunch of different skills. That's not to say that at the end of the day, the thing that is reported to it, and particularly to investors, and let's be honest, the majority of reporting is to investors. I know that we all pretend that it's to stakeholders, but it's fundamentally an investor tool, needs to happen at the same time. And I think that's the point that's really important here. When you separate out non-financial reporting and financial reporting, inherently, non-financial reporting becomes less important, right? Because you've made the decision already. So, you know what I mean? It's a different group of people. So I think the most important thing in reporting is to do it at the same time. Whether it needs to be done as integrated as I think you're sort of pertaining to, is we're probably a way away from.
There's another question, and I apologize, sir.
Yeah, hi, this is Aditya from Maycode. My question is around, in the context of reporting, premature reporting or negligence during reporting or willful blindness. How does the case of greenwashing, how does it play in these three categories? Thank you.
Do you want to take that, Giles?
Oh, yeah, I'm happy. I mean, you know, greenwashing. I mean, in a sense, what Charlotte, do you want to talk about greenwashing? I mean, I think to what Charlotte's been saying, you know, is to try and get out of the greenwashing by science driving, you know, how data is calculated, science in terms of how reduction is proven to get to, and offsets that actually stand up for a gold standard rather than some you know, dodgy offset that someone's got off the back of a lorry, will go some direction, in my view, to dealing with greenwashing. I think in my 26 years of talking to boards about, you know, non-financial reporting, I don't think companies start by going, we want to try and greenwash people in this process. I really don't. I don't think people are sort of setting out to sort of hoodwink people that they are they're sort of, let's say we're really good and then not do anything at all. I think that although there are very good examples where that has happened, so the more clarity we can provide as to how organizations should be measuring, providing reduction plans, etc., and to the frameworks that Charlotte talked about with the IMF, etc., I think the likelihood that we can just strip out a lot of the sort of I think the communication flannel that sometimes goes around trying to do the right thing, and I think that's where greenwashing really ends up. It's Tony Blair sexing up the Iraq document. You know, that's where I think a lot of the problems lie, not in the actual, how do we measure this? What are we going to do? What are we committing to? And how are we going to try and do something about it? And that's the corporate's fault as well. So I'm not trying to, you know, say that's not their responsibility, but I think it lies in the communication department as much as anywhere else. Charlotte, have you got anything you'd add to that?
Yes, no, thank you. That's very interesting, actually, because I think it also, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think, I mean, it comes down to the, of course, to the science-based nature of what's done and whatnot. Comes down to the fact that this whole pressure, obviously, to, you know, to turn green and of course, so many hurdles, and the fact that, you know, underlying policies don't always follow. Which is also something very much important, that the pricing of carbon doesn't always follow, and all of these elements, you know, like put all that pressure on companies that indeed, in terms of communications to your stakeholders, shareholders primarily, but also, you know, your clients and society, may lead to greenwashing. I think it also comes down to the issue of supervision. I mean, you know, we have now all of these you know, climate-related disclosure requirements that again form the sort of the basis of what we mean by greening financial sector policy. Well, you know, it comes down to how do you audit that information. It comes down to the training also of auditors, the adaptation of auditor rules to be able to give assurance on transition plans, for instance, or on the value, I mean, on the, not the value, sorry, the credibility of net zero commitments. And it comes down to the control and supervision of all that by the financial supervisors themselves, especially when it comes not to, you know, only disclosures by non-financial companies, but also those by financial institutions themselves. You know, we always...
Charlotte, I'm terribly sorry, we're running out of time. I'm going to have to draw a line and say thank you very much indeed for joining us.
You're welcome.
And thank you to Giles for your excellent contribution. And please can we say thank you to all our panelists. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We did actually have another question from the audience, so I'm afraid you're going to...
I'm sorry, I couldn't work out what you were saying.
No,
No,
I sort of was, and wasn't just you, but anyway, would you mind if we give this person a chance to ask their one question?
So I'm so sorry. It was a...
Happy to do so. Thanks very much, Adrienne. My name's Tom Harding from ESGRS, and I've got a fairly open-ended and broad question to all. Very short. So in the new age of ESG that we're all currently in today, where we're looking at greenwashing and TCFD and net zero and taxonomies, etc., rather than ESG ratings and screening and controversies, in your opinion and from your experience, what are the key challenges that senior management and board level executives are facing with respect to holding the industry to account?
And again, Giles, if you could answer that, but again, if I could ask you to do it quite briefly, that would be marvelous.
Can I just be really clear, when you say, do you mean that shareholders holding them to account, or boards of the organizations that are having to provide that information?
Yeah, both-sided, whichever way you'd prefer to answer it, and perhaps from your perspective, more directed to the corporate side of the market.
Look, I think the thing that I find at the moment, boards are running to catch up you know, TCFD, you know, it's like people are going, ah, shit, what the hell's that? You know, I know we've got to do it by March of next year. Can you tell, you know, is it different? You know, so I think there's a lot of things being thrown, rightly so, at organizations to make the information that they're providing more specific. I think there does need to be some recognition that there's lots and lots of people wanting lots and lots of information in order to try and, you know, help them make better informed decisions. And companies have a finite amount of people and ability to do that. And of course, regulatory ones come first. But then, you know, fantastic investors who you want to reply to because they really care about X, Y, and Z, needing to tailor your responses back to individual groups is really hard. And so I think boards are struggling with how to deal with the sort of the torrent of things that they need to do. And I come back to this area. If we spend too much time just dealing with information and not trying to actually implement the changes, then we're really buggered. And, you know, there are too many sustainability departments in organizations. All they do is try and get the information and report it. And they're not really involved in making sure whether the business is actually implementing or not. That's sort of okay because we need the businesses to do the delivery. The operations need to do delivery, not the sort of bits on the edge. And that's as sustainability has got more centralized, you know, as a core business function, everyone's involved in it. But they still need to play some other role than just simply getting that information and reporting it out to stakeholders.
It's a great way to wrap it up. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you very, very much.